She went from there and said people were buried in a septic tank. There's nothing else that would lead anybody to believe that. There's no written documentation, no oral documentation, no evidence anywhere else, as far as I know, that ever leads one to think that.
So what do you think happened to the remains of these babies?
I think they were buried with coffins in the normal way, but also there was also a crypt. There's actually two different types of burials on the site.
The issue of the Tuam Mother and Baby Home is one that rocked the country, with the central allegation being that some 800 babies were thrown in a septic tank by nuns in Tuam, County Galway. Historian Brian Nugent, however, has written a book in its third edition now that claims, on the contrary, that these babies were in fact interred in coffins and in a crypt. So joining us now is Brian Nugent. Brian, you're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Brian, is there any evidence to suggest that these babies were actually in coffins and crypts as opposed to being thrown in a septic tank?
Well, yes. I mean, there is a lot of evidence. The crypt issue comes from a person who fell into a crypt. And I interviewed her myself, and she pointed out the place of the crypt. And she talks about bodies being wrapped in shrouds on shelving, which is clearly a crypt. And there's also other evidence to suggest that there was a tunnel to that crypt, maybe from the sacristy. So there is a crypt on the one hand. On the other hand, we have an awful lot of evidence relating to coffins. There's overwhelming evidence relating to coffins. There's approximately 19 advertisements in the local newspapers for coffins for the Tuam Children's Home. And also in this report itself, it refers to the minutes of the committee that ran the home, a branch of the County Council, and manager's orders, which both talk about many references to needing coffins for the Tuam Children's Home as well. So, and complained about the expense, etc. There's many detailed references to coffins for the, but they dismiss all that in this report. Even though you have all these references to tenders for coffins, they then try to confuse matters and say there's no evidence the coffins were actually bought, whatever that means. I mean, they have the evidence of it being tendered, so somehow it's all a conspiracy at the time, according to this commission, in the sense that they tendered for it but never actually bought any, which is just ludicrous. On top of that, we have Catherine Corus herself interviewed two carpenters' families within Tuam who also talked about building coffins for the home. And we have another person whose father was in the home who told him definitively that he remembers seeing coffins being built for the children in the home. So overwhelming evidence related to coffins.
And so in the latest report, they took photographs of a structure that they dug up, and it has 20 lids, and it essentially is what they believe to have been the septic tank into which babies were supposedly thrown. What is your own take on that particular structure?
Yeah, it's definitely for me a structure deliberately created by the County Council to house the reinterred remains. You see, the County Council were under pressure to build an access road to the backs of the houses that had been built on the site, and also to put in a playground. There's a lot of political stuff going on here. They were under that pressure, and they clearly, therefore, reduced the size of the previous graveyard. They just reduced it in size. So they had to do something with the remains that they would have dug up in the part that they had reduced when they built the access road and built the playground. So clearly, this structure is where they reinterred those remains.
And when was the structure built, in your view?
In my opinion, late 1970s, early 1980s.
And so the nuns had already left the home at that point. The home was closed.
Yeah, long since.
And this was a structure rebuilt, or this was a structure built for the reinterment of remains that were elsewhere in the graveyard.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's 21 openings to 20 chambers.
And what is the structure called?
Well, I call it an ossuary. In this report, they have usually about 3 different terms for each of their structures. So they just call it technical names in this report.
And is an ossuary something that would have been used elsewhere in the country?
Now you see, so I call it an ossuary because an ossuary is a technical name for a structure that you use to reinter bones. An ossuary wouldn't be all that common in Ireland. Crypts are very common. But an ossuary, therefore, is really a reinterment because you don't just get bones when you bury a body anyway. So crypts are very common in Ireland, very common in Irish graveyards, and it was not all that much of a surprise to find a crypt here. But an ossuary, no, that's only really a reinterring, and it's not all that common in Ireland. No, I wouldn't say so. This is simply to place as a reinterment spot for bones that were thrown up under the construction work of the site. And there's a number of good reasons why we can see that is so. For example, if your body is discovered where you were buried, in other words, if a person is buried 20 years later, they dig up the grave, they have what they call articulation. meaning that the bones, say, of your arm, your fingers will be joined together. Well, not joined together in the sense that the tissue would have gone, but the bones themselves would clearly show an arm that disintegrated at the one spot, and all your other bones. You see, your ribs would be beside each other, etc. Anyway, in forensic and in archaeological terms, they call that articulation. Now, if the bodies were buried where they say they were, where they're now found, they would be articulated remains, because you'll see then all the bones linked together, etc., etc. Now, these bones are disarticulated remains, and it is perfectly obvious to that effect. And you can see a few quotes that I have in the book, that shows that the people who looked at it said they were disarticulated. In other words, the jumble of bones, which you wouldn't get if they were buried at the one spot. So, so that's one reason why we can see that they're reburied remains and not buried at where they're currently found.
And in the ossuary, as you call it, the structure that was documented in the latest report, it also turned out that a petrol can was found. Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, it's a Castrol GTX oil can. So they took that out, and you can see a photograph of it in the report. And they went to date it. And it's dated definitively after 1968. So that artifact and numerous other artifacts found immediately beside the ossuary again leads you to believe that it's post-dated after 1961, after the nuns left anyway.
Which is more evidence that these babies probably weren't thrown in a septic tank at all.
No.
But were reinterred in a new structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Reinterred, definitely, yeah.
And are you surprised that the report didn't come to that conclusion that you have?
Yes, I am surprised. Yeah, I think that if you were an archaeologist just looking at these structures, with the fresh eyes and with non-influenced eyes by the current controversy, you would definitely conclude that structure was built approximately in the 70s and 80s. You would never, there's nothing about it. They consistently say in the report, it might have something to do with wastewater and sewerage. And for example, with no pipes going into or out of it, that's a nonsensical argument. I think when you look at the artifacts found in it, you look at the nature of it. It uses some precast concrete, which is of quite a late date in Ireland as well. And another phenomenon is that you can look at the way the soil layers go in the cross section between that structure and the remains of the genuine sewage system. See, there is a small cesspool that was found. It's about 4.5 meters away from it. And what they try to do in the report is link that structure and the structure where they found the bones. But they include a cross section of the soil layers, which you do when you do archaeology. I dig through it and I get a grey layer and a blue layer or whatever of soil. So when you look at the soil layers, you can see the way that the structure, the ossuary, was built at the same time that the cesspool was underground. And you can see from that they've no relationship with one another. You have to go back to the beginning and say, well, where does the evidence arise that anybody ever said there was such a thing as babies buried in a septic tank? And there's only one piece of evidence ever presented, that ever claims that. And that is that, when Catherine Corris went to look at the history of this graveyard that she was asked to look at, she was able to map the current graveyard and take maps from the previous workhouse, which is where the children's home moved into. And on those old maps, you can see the site of what's called an old cesspool. Now, it's not quite the same as a septic tank anyway, but if you look at the map of where the cesspool is and look at the map of the current graveyard, you can see they're coterminous. Obviously, the cesspool was within the current graveyard, but it's much smaller than it. It's about a third of the total area. But that's it. That's all that the controversy arises. She went from there and said people were buried in a septic tank. There's nothing else that would lead anybody to believe that. There's no written documentation, no oral documentation, no evidence anywhere else, as far as I know, that ever leads one to think that.